extol thee, who are born of thee. Wider still and wider shall thy bounds be set. God who made thee mighty, make thee mightier yet. God who made thee mighty, make thee mightier
Good evening and welcome to two stories by Arthur Christopher Benson, author of the words of Land of Hope and Glory. The first one was published in 1913 in the Magdalen College Cambridge magazine under the very feeble pseudonym B. It's called Quia Nominor. Mr. John Byron, who held a John Smith Fellowship at Magdalen until his death in 1788 at the age of 63, seems to have been a man of noted inefficiency. He had gone to the bar as a young man, where it was certain he had obtained a single brief, given him apparently by the kindness of the college, in an action against a tenant for cutting and selling timber privately. Now, this much I can say was certain because Mr. Byron brought it up very frequently in his talk. But it was held to be no less certain that he'd never obtained another brief, for he would assuredly have made mention of it. He subsisted miserably enough in London on his fellowship, which was poorly endowed, and then he returned to Cambridge, where he was not much welcome. The college made him a lecturer, however, and here he failed again grievously, being quite unable to command the attention or even the silence of his class. After which experiment, when he was not again appointed, he lived in his rooms the greater part of the year. But strange to say, this proved incompetence in all practical affairs was accompanied by a most inordinate vanity. Mr. Byron was vain of his name, of his appearance, which was meagre and slovenly, of his experience, which was small, and most of all of his conversation, which reached a degree of tediousness impossible to describe. I mean, he was both voluble and embarrassed in discourse, fond of telling a few very dreary anecdotes, so that his company was much dreaded by all merry men. He was something of a free thinker, and he He spoke very scornfully of the intelligence of others, and he was moreover a greedy man, eating profusely and in a very slatternly manner. His waistcoat was generally garnished with the drippings of gravy and ale. But being a man of no natural affection, he cared very little how distasteful this was to his fellows, and he lived a slothful life, walking much about the town in the mornings and staring at everyone he met, while in evenings he sat alone in his rooms and was very peevish. And so the years moved on with but little change. One day, Mr. Byron sat in hall next to a visitor, a courteous and ingenious philosopher, learned in all departments of curious knowledge. Mr. Byron, as was his wont, was speaking of his excellent handling of the case against the tenant of the college, and he went on to talk very lengthily of the ancient family to which he belonged and all the glories of his name. His visitor said that he said to the visitor that no one had ever been able to tell him the origin of the name, at which the philosopher laughed and said that was plain enough. It was a Scandinavian name, he said, of common use in Norway, where it was called Björn, and it had the signification of a bear. The family, he said, bore a bear's crest, a bear's head as a crest. Now, the visitor went on to talk of the strange way in which certain animals and fowls were attached to certain clans and families, and he spoke of some curious customs that seemed formerly to have existed in northern tribes, by which it was forbidden for any tribesman to slay the animal which was the sign of his tribe. And I dare say, Mr. Byron, he said, that some of your ancestors had trouble enough with bears, which they met in hunting and weren't permitted to slay. Very like, sir, said Mr. Byron, who was displeased that the talk should pass out of his hands. And he went on to tell stories of his family and their greatness, and especially of his great uncle, who, in Mr. Byron's description of him, became a very notable man, although in fact he had been a tallow chandler from Ipswich. The company would have wished to hear more of the philosopher's conversation, but Mr. Byron allowed him no second chance, and he talked very wearifully all the afternoon. A day or two after, Mr. Byron was walking about Cambridge in the morning, and, as was his wont, staring at all those that he met, when he saw a little ring of people in the corner of the marketplace. He hurried thither to see what the affair was, and pushing into the gathering, he saw that a circle had been formed around two men of foreign appearance, who led with them a great brown bear. The bear wore a little velvet coat on its shoulders and a cocked hat on its head, and shouldered a pole which he held in his long claws. He seemed to be very friendly and obedient to the men, and at a word of command he danced a little in the ring, lifting up and setting down his flat feet very clumsily. His little eyes and his red tongue, which lolled out of his mouth across his white teeth, seemed very curious to Mr. Byron, and he pressed further into the ring till he was on the inside. The bear came round, still dancing, but when he got close, so close that Mr. Byron could perceive his strong and acrid odour, he came to a stop, regarded Mr. Byron very curiously, and dropping his pole, trotted towards him, as if recognising an old acquaintance. Mr. Byron was taken with a sudden terror and cried out, and one of the men called the bear off, who picked up the pole humbly enough and continued his dance. But Mr. Byron conceived a great disgust of the whole matter, and he slipped out of the throng, feeling sick and shaky and entirely unmanned. He had a sense that he'd been in danger. He knew not of what sort, and that the bear would have hugged him in his arms if the men had not interfered. He couldn't get the business out of his head, and for some days after he was ill at ease, sleeping brokenly, and often dreaming of the sullen little eyes of the bear and that red tongue lolling out of his mouth. He gave up his usual walk in the town and He strolled instead in the college garden. It was a week later that in some dumb hour of the night, Mr. Byron woke up suddenly and wished for day. His rooms were on the ground floor on the south side of the court near the porter's lodge. He woke with a sense of great discomfort, feeling as though something had leaned over him and touched his arm. He had felt, he thought, a hot and fetid breath on his face, and what added to his alarm was that he could discern the heavy scent of a bear, just as he smelt the one in the marketplace. Now, he dared not move at first, but presently he took courage and made a light and fearfully looked around, and all was as it should be. He got up at last with the taper in his hand and went out into his ugly and comfortless sitting room, even as far as his outer door, which was securely closed. He felt clearer now, and he opened a little cupboard where he kept some brandy. He took a dram, and he soon was valiant once more. The clock struck 3, and Mr. Byron betook himself to bed again, but he couldn't sleep. And he was glad when the light began to filter in among his curtains, and the sparrows fell to twittering in the ivy. Soon after this, the vacation came on. The scholars all departed, and most of the fellows travelled away, and Mr. Byron was left alone in the college, except for the dean, a somnolent old man who had no use for talk. Very dull were the dinners that the two men shared. But you see, Mr. Byron could simply not hold his peace for long, and bit by bit he told the dean the story of his meeting with the bear and his fancy of the night. The old man heard him very inattentively and said that such fancies were uncomfortable things, and that Mr. Byron had better go off for a visit and shake such thoughts from his head. "It's an ill thing," said the dean, "when a man gets to brood upon bears and such outlandish cattle. It's a disorder of the mind, Mr. Byron. There is an old story of a family, the name of which I cannot call to mind, the head of which is visited on occasions by the sight of a great white bird poising in his chamber, and it means no good. Well, I would not have any fellows of this college to tamper with the thought of birds of the air or beasts of the wood visiting them in their chambers at dead of night. It's an ill thing, Mr. Byron, and it's a boding thing. Yes, a man should read scripture at such times and pray a little, for both of which exercises I fear you have but little stomach." Well, Mr. Byron said that he thought that strong ale and brandy were a more manful cure, but the dean shook his head and would say no more on the subject, or indeed upon any other subject at all. Mr. Byron was now left quite alone in the college, for the dean departed soon, and he was in great dudgeon. He parted with his appetite and could only palter with toast and tea, which he laced with brandy. He gave up going into hall, and he sat much in his rooms, beating a tattoo with his fingers on the table. It was then that he took to writing a good deal in his little notebook, from which the event that followed is closely taken. Now, it appears from this book that Mr. Byron was not at peace with himself, and that he had a sore heart about his wasted and selfish life. He made some entries, too, about the strange doom which befalls certain families, and he wrote down some silly tales of his boyhood and youth, which had no beginning or end. I'll give you an example now. "When I was in the garden," he wrote, "I remember that Marjorie came to me and showed me some pears which Mrs. Vickers had given her and offered me to share them. I said no, but that I would play her for them at a game which we used called Pattle Pottle. Then I cheated her and won all the pears and ate them and laughed at her, so that she did not contain her tears. I wish that I hadn't cheated Marjorie. She died April the 8th, 1748 of a quinsy, but that was long after. I did not like her husband. He spoke injuriously to me." And so the notes rambled on without any order. And then comes the the following entry, which is written in a very wild hand. The worst thing I ever saw in my life, but I'm constrained to set it down for fear of I know not what. May God spare me and have mercy on me and forgive my disbelief. It was thus. I woke very unquiet, I suppose about 3 a.m. This was Wednesday, I think. I'm not sure of this. I'm not sure of anything. And getting up, I heard something go softly to and fro in my outer chamber. Something brushed by the door, and it was thrice pushed and rattled, but it held. And then I heard something sniff and blow under the bottom of the door. And the smell. I cannot write of the smell, for it sickens me. And then I heard it pad about again, and again it sniffed and blew beneath the door. And all this time I stood and dared not move, so I grew stiff and cold. And then the day came in very slowly, and silence fell. And at last I took courage and opened the door. The room was grey and dim. But oh dear, how can I write it? Oh God, be merciful. The bear sat there, as I feared. He was all hunched up opposite the door, looking at me out of his little eyes, and I saw its teeth and the redness of its tongue. I shut the door and fainted after that and crept to my bed. But now I cannot put the smell away from my nostrils. Was ever man in such a horror? Now that passage is followed by some unintelligible scrawls, which appear to be fragments of Psalm 95, whoso dwelleth, etc., very imperfectly remembered. There is but one more entry 2 days later. I've seen nothing further, and the horror is a little abated. But I cannot get the stench of the beast out of my rooms. My clothes seem infected with it, and it hangs about my food. I've sat indoors too much of late. I must go abroad more and walk more. This and a regular course of life and diet with prayer may help me. I dare not go to any physician, and if I went to a clergyman, I know not where I could make a beginning. I cannot rid myself of the thought that some disaster is awaiting me, but I cannot conjecture what. It is too late, I fear, to live differently. If only it had been 20 years ago. The curse of my house is fallen upon me through my own great fault. If I had but one friend in the world, I could go forward in hope. If little Marjorie had lived, she would understand. Now, the end came very swiftly, but the only record I can find of the event is a brief obituary notice of Mr. Byron in the Gentleman's Magazine of July the 20th, 1788. It runs as follows. On the 18th of July, at the Fish and Duck Inn, Cottenham, died Mr. John Byron, Fellow of Magdalen College, Cambridge, a facetious and well-respected man. His death was occasioned by a singular accident. The deceased gentleman, who was in excellent health, was accustomed to take long walks in the neighbourhood of Cambridge, where he resided. On the morning of July the 18th, 2 Norwegian sailors, known as Swain and Byrne, were showing a trained bear in the street at Cottenham when Mr. Byron suddenly turned out of a side street. The bear, for some cause not explained, broke loose and made as if to embrace Mr. Byron. He turned to run with the bear close upon him, but collapsed to the ground, and the bear took hold of him. He was at once extricated, but he seemed to be in a fit occasioned by terror from which he did not rally, and he died the same afternoon. At an inquiry which was held, Swain, the bear guard, gave the bear a good character and said that it could be trusted safely with the smallest child. He said indeed that the behaviour of the animal seemed to show that he recognised in Mr. Byron an old friend and wished to testify affection rather than any enmity. It had been intended that the bear should be destroyed, but the man Swain pleaded very earnestly for it as an old favourite of his and as his only means of livelihood. And as the doctor said that Mr. Byron had received no hurt from the bear, Mr. Cutluck, the magistrate, decided in Swain's favour and let the Norwegians go. Mr. Byron will be buried in St. Peter's churchyard at Cambridge, and is sincerely regretted by all who knew him. The second one was published 6 years after that, the same magazine, under the same pseudonym, in 1919, and it's called The Sparsholt Stone. The year was 1817, the month October, the time the forenoon, when two old friends and cronies, Mr. Ducantoy and Dr. Friend, went out for a long walk, an exercise of which they were very fond. It was a still, rather cold day of autumn, the trees turning yellow and the leaves drifting down into the tangled grass. A little bluish mist hung lightly over the fields and fallows. They walked up Madingley Hill and presently took a path among the meadows. Now, a word or two about each man. Ducantoy was an old Huguenot name, du Comtois, of which the owner was proud, and it was commonly pronounced decanter by the gyps, with no untoward application, for he was an abstemious man. He was Spendluff Fellow of Magdalen College, and the gentlest of fellows, looking like a faded angel, blonde and long-haired. He was a sort of an antiquary, but he had no ostensible occupation. It never occurred to him to wonder what exactly he was paid to do, although if the good Spendluff, the founder of his fellowship, had endowed the post to keep a man out of mischief, then he'd certainly succeeded in this case. Ducantoy was the least mischievous of mankind. He never said a harsh word or framed an injurious thought, and he was greatly beloved. Dr. Friend was a very different person. He lived in an odd little house in Chesterton Lane, which is full of curiosities. He'd been a fleet surgeon and had knocked about the world a good deal. He was connected with no college and was generally deemed eccentric. His manner was abstracted and his speech was scanty and rough. He was a tall, dusky man who walked fast, swinging his arms. He looked as though he'd been hung up in a chimney corner, like bacon to be smoked, and as if he'd been left hanging a little too long. Now, what had brought these two men together, it is hard to say, but they spent much time in each other's company with obvious enjoyment. Dr. Friend was never rough with Mr. Ducantoy, but he spoke to him indulgently as to a child. As they walked, a distant sound, the baying of a pack of hounds, broke on their ear. Now, the hounds of the old Childerley hunt were at that time kennelled at Madingley Hall and hunted by Squire Cotton. Mr. Ducantoy had certain ancient phrases which amused Dr. Friend. He spoke of a gun as a musket or a fowling piece. And today, after standing for a moment to listen, he said, "It seems as though the hunt were up." "Yes, the Childerley," said Dr. Friend. Now that by this time they were almost in sight of the pack, which was, however, concealed from them by a hedge, and something very odd was going on. The hounds were howling and yelling as if their fox was in full view, but the whips appeared mixed up with the pack, shouting and slashing at the dogs, and no riders were visible. They got onto a rabbit, I dare say, said Dr. Friend. Now, these sounds soon died away, and the men continued their walk. But presently they heard the howling of a dog, a very peculiar cry, made at intervals. Oh, it sounds like that poor fellow's in pain, said de Cantoy after a moment's listening. We should go and see what is the matter. Well, Dr. Friend assented, and guided by the sound, they came at last to a deep, wide ditch, almost dry. In this was crouching a foxhound, holding up a front paw that was dripping with blood, head in the air, and uttering lugubrious moans. Now that is very odd, said Dr. Friend, and he slipped down into the ditch and approached the dog. Oh no, friend, please, said Mr. de Cantoy. No, please, I'm sorry, I must implore you, don't go near him. He might be mad. He might bite you. I beg you, don't touch him. Pish, said Dr. Friend. I'd like to meet the dog that would bite me. And he went straight up to the animal and took hold of the wounded paw. It ceased howling and looked up at him. Hello, said Dr. Friend. There's been a spear here. Most extraordinary. A spear? Said Mr. de Cantoy. Yeah, a spear. Oh, you can see where it went in. A broad spear with a central ridge. See how the skin is strained in the centre. That's a strong thrust too, but the point was stopped by the bone, peripetal bone to be exact. Certainly plenty of blood, but the dog is more frightened than hurt, I think. He took out his handkerchief and began to wind it carefully around the injured paw. The dog licked his hand once or twice when it hurt him. Oh, but friend, a spear wound? Out on these uplands? Surely not. What did I just say? Yeah, a spear wound, said Dr. Friend rather fractiously. Yet there are things that I know about and you do not, de Cantoy, and I can tell you that this is a wound from a spear. I've seen dozens like it. And Mr. de Cantoy said no more until the wound was tied up. And then, very gently, as if to soothe Dr. Friend, he said, well, they say that they cut the hedges out this way with a sword instead of a billhook. It may be that, perhaps. What? No, it is a spear wound, I tell you. Dear me, de Cantoy, how often do I have to say it? Here, now, come on, boy. The dog crept out of the ditch and followed Mr. Friend. To heel, sirrah, said Mr. de Cantoy. It should be noted that he always called a dog sirrah, just as he always called a cat poor pussy. They went across the fields in the direction of a little hamlet, the dog shuffling along on three legs behind them, holding up its wounded paw. Now, the hamlet that they had entered consisted merely of 4 white-walled thatched cottages disposed around a triangular bit of rough grass. An aged villager was standing in the middle of this, and Dr. Friend told him about the dog. Oh, I know all about him already, said the old man. He's from the Childerley. They've been along here this morning for exercise. I'm Strutt, sir. That's my name. I used to be second huntsman to Squire Frost at Childerley. Yeah, well, the dog has got a bad cut, I'm afraid, said Dr. Friend, and he'd best lie up for a bit. Oh, don't you worry, sir. I'll take him in, said Mr. Strutt. Be like old times, and I'll take him down to Squire Cotton's later on. That'll amuse me, will that? Well, thank you. And look, here's a shilling for your trouble, said Dr. Friend. But look, here, that's a very odd sort of cut, isn't it? The old man looked at him curiously and said, I think I know about that too, sir. Like a wound from a spiked railing. That'll be it, I dare say. They got out of hand, these dogs, today, and I see it all. They couldn't whip them off. Appears it happens all the time. What do you mean? Said Dr. Friend. Well, just as I say, sir, it's always happening about now. I've seen it a dozen times, and all the whips know it. And old Squire Frost, he used to cuss himself into a fine passion over it. It's always on the Portway, as we call it, that bridle track along the fields that goes by Hardwick and down to Bourne. The dogs, they seem to view something and try to run it down. They seem in a sort of a fury like, very angry, No shouting or whipping does any good. They run it right down here, the Sparsholt Green, and then it goes to earth, whatever it may be. And the dogs, then they seem sort of ashamed of themselves. And there's always 2 or 3 has got a wound, like that one. That's why Squire Frost used to cuss so heavy. It's a queer business, all told. And yeah, well, the less said about it, the better, I say. Dr. Friend shook his head. Well, Strut, I trust that you will take the dog down to the kennel when he can travel. Good. Well, we should be getting on, Duke Antoy, eh? Oh, by the way, Strut, what do you call this place? Sparsholt Green, sir, said Strut. It was at this moment that Mr. Duke Antoy, who had been looking curiously about him during that conversation, made his great discovery. Oh, one moment. Friend, look at this. This was a big stone of a reddish colour and a very smooth grain that lay in the centre of the little green. It was square, and it looked as if it had been roughly shaped. There were things like rude shafts at the 4 corners. The top of the stone was flat, but a ledge had been cut out at one end, in which were 2 roughly shaped holes, like basins, and a little channel led from the top of the stone down to them. What is this, Mr. Strut? Said Duke Antoy. Oh, that's just an old stone, sir. Yeah, that lay there many a year. The children have their games there, they do. Well, it looks to me distinctly Gothic, said Mr. Duke Antoy. Maybe the base of a font, perhaps. Oh, friend, you know what? This would be the very thing for the rockery at Magdalen. Quite a curiosity. Would it be possible to purchase this, Mr. Strut? Well, I dare say so. But my advice to you, sir, is to leave it lying. Yeah, there's an old rhyme hereabouts. What's the rhyme? The rhyme is, best leave alone a big old stone. Yeah, well, that's very quaint, of course, said Mr. Duke Antoy, but I know I've taken a fancy to this stone. Well, what do you say, Mr. Strut? 4 houses here, that might be half a crown apiece, 10 shillings, and another shilling and a pint of beer to anyone who'll bring it down to Cambridge for me. How does that sound? Well, yeah, you could have it for that, sir. I make no doubt. But I'd leave it if I were you. Yeah, yes, Duke Antoy, said Friend. I think best to leave it. There are nasty things under old stones, you know. But Duke Antoy was not to be persuaded. He would walk up next day and see it taken up, and it could be transported easily enough in a wheelbarrow if Mr. Strut would be good enough to arrange it. Well, true to his word, Mr. Duke Antoy walked up next day alone. Strut and another willing inhabitant prized up the stone. There seemed to be a little edging of the stones underneath, which had supported the bigger stone, and there was a hollow in the ground in which lay the antler of a deer and another bone, which Mr. Duke Antoy did not like the look of. He pushed this down into the earth as far as it would go. Well, the money was handed over, and Mr. Duke Antoy directed the men to Magdalen, and he walked on ahead. Strut reported that the dog was better, but he seemed to have lost his spirit. He just sits shivering all day, sir. He won't eat or drink. A bad scare, that's what it is, let alone the cut. But Mr. Duke Antoy was much too interested in the stone to give much heed to that. Other stone arrived in Magdalen in due course and was hauled into Mr. Duke Antoy's room on the ground floor of the the front court and deposited in a little sitting room opening out of the study where Mr. du Cantoy kept his hats and coats and a few bulkier curiosities like a gargoyle and a Purbeck shaft from Biggin Abbey. And it was soon after this that his illness began. I mean, he'd caught cold, he supposed, on his walk with Dr. Friend. And the worst part of it was that he kept having extremely vivid and alarming dreams. One in particular haunted him, night after night. Always began in the same way. He was walking in a place full of thorn thickets when he became aware of something sinister and hostile drawing near. He described it to Dr. Friend. I walk on, he said. I turn a corner and I see a man standing or sitting. And this fellow appears to be watching me. He's like the line in Shakespeare, a wretched, ragged man o'ergrown with hair. He's clothed in a rough tunic, which is blue, I think, and much patched. And his hair sprouts out everywhere. Beard and long straggling locks over his forehead, all tangled up, grows on his arms and legs. But his legs are also wound around with strips of cloth. And he's wearing boots, shapeless boots of skin. Anyway, his eyes, they glare at me out of his hairy face, fixed and angry, like the eyes of a wild beast. And he carries a pole in his hand. And I know that I've got to run away from him. But, oh, Friend, it's horrible. You know, I hurtle in and out among the thickets. Sometimes he follows me, but the worst is when he disappears suddenly and it all goes quiet. And then I know that he's ahead of me, lying in wait. And anyway, when I wake up, I'm all in a sweat. Pish, said Dr. Friend. A mere nightmare. No, you take regular walks and drink a pint of mulled beer last thing at night. These are mere fancies, du Cantoy. You mustn't yield to them. But for all that, Mr. du Cantoy got worse. And he took to sitting all day, shivering over his fire. Dr. Friend was often with him, and he was alarmed to see how he lost flesh. He sometimes persuaded Mr. du Cantoy to walk, but then he'd turn faint, and would have to return leaning on Dr. Friend's arm. It culminated at last on a cold December morning. The porter, going through the court, heard Mr. du Cantoy shouting for help. He ran upstairs, but Mr. du Cantoy was not in his sitting room. And then he heard a smothered cry from the little lumber room. And going in, he found Mr. du Cantoy half lying, half crouching in a corner, with his hands out before him, as if he was pushing something away. He was deadly pale, streaming with sweat. Well, the porter assisted him into the other room and onto a sofa, and then he went and sent out for Dr. Friend, and he returned, not liking to leave the poor old man alone. Mr. du Cantoy lay on the sofa, his face a leaden colour now, faintly moving his hands and muttering to himself. Now, while they waited, a faint rhythmic tapping was heard by the sofa, and the porter, getting up to see what it was horrified to see blood dripping out of Mr. du Cantoy's shoe and dropping to the ground in a pool. And then he observed that by his thigh there was a wound of some kind, bleeding heavily. Well, he was going to fetch a towel when Mr. Friend appeared, took in the situation at a glance, sent the porter flying to get some lint, and hurriedly disrobing his friend, he found a long, ugly gash in his thigh. Now this he contrived to bind up, and then he administered restoratives, and after a little time he contrived to get Mr. du Cantoy to bed, and he installed himself in the room as a nurse. He waited by the bed and was relieved to see the colour slowly return to his friend's face and hands, although he still muttered at intervals, and once or twice he cried out sharply. The next morning he was better and he could talk a little, but he just couldn't say exactly what had occurred. He dreamed persistently, he said, about the hairy man, and had lain in bed feeling too ill to get up, falling into heavy stupors of sleep, unable to distinguish imagination from reality. He had got up at last and dressed, but he couldn't eat anything, and he'd fallen asleep again at his table with his head on his hands. On waking up, he'd seen the man standing near him in a menacing attitude. So he'd fled into the little room into which something had pursued him, hacked at him, thrust at him. He didn't know what had happened. Now, some complication was introduced to the story by Dr. Friend's discovering in the little room a carving knife on the breakfast table lying on the ground, stained with blood. Oh yes. Now I recollect now, said Mr. de Cantoy. I caught that up to defend myself. Well, Dr. Friend persuaded him at last to believe that the wound had been accidentally self-inflicted, and he told a precise story to that effect to the fellows of the college. But one thing he did not tell. When Mr. de Cantoy had done telling his tale, he was silent for a little, and then he said, "Friend?" "Yes," said Dr. Friend, nodding. "I know what you're going to say. It shall be taken back this afternoon. My man will come here and sit with you, and I will see it replaced myself. You're quite right, de Cantoy." "I think," said de Cantoy faintly, "that the antler had better go back too." "What antler?" said Dr. Friend. "You'll find it on the stone," said Mr. de Cantoy. And indeed, there was the antler, and stranger still, it was stained and discoloured in a most unpleasant way. Well, Dr. Friend bundled the whole thing up in a sacking, hired a cart, drove out to Sparsholt, and with Strutt's help replaced the stone. When it was back, as they stood looking at it, Strutt said, "The old gentleman should have left it alone, sir. It's poor work made the..." But then he stopped suddenly. "What was that?" said Dr. Friend, looking pale under his dusky complexion. That cry." "It'll be someone shouting by the homelands," said Strutt. "Good God! I thought it came from the stone," said Friend. "Well, so it do, sir," said Strutt. The two men stood and looked at each other, and a thin cry, half stifled, rose upon the air. "There's something in there," said Friend, struggling with a sense of sudden sickness. "Let it be, sir," said Strutt. "Just let it be. That ain't a troublesome cry. Someone's pleased, sure enough." "Good God," said Friend, and he walked off without a word. Now, it was some 3 months after the events I told you about, when Dr. Friend and Mr. de Cantoy were sitting on each side of the fire in the parlour of a snug little inn at Weymouth, to which Dr. Friend had carried his convalescent off for change of air. Mr. de Cantoy had never alluded to the circumstances attending his illness, and Dr. Friend had begun to hope that they had faded from his mind. But suddenly, as they sat in silence looking at the fire, Mr. de Cantoy spoke. "You know, Friend, there seems to be something very mysterious about the whole business which ended in my illness. May I say a few words to you about it? I've striven to think that it was all a mere disordered dream. But I cannot so regard it, because the events which caused the illness stand out so clearly in my mind, and the illness seems to me the result and not the cause of them. I mean, the strange hunting scene, the removal of the stone. It was then that, to the best of my knowledge, I was in perfectly tranquil health. But after that, my recollection's still disordered. What do you think of it all? Well, said Dr. Friend gravely, since you ask me, I will speak. I think that you, who have lived so carefully and so quietly, are more surprised at coming across this streak of strange affairs, if I may so call it, than a man like myself who has gone about the world and seen iniquity. Mind you, he went on with uplifted finger, I do not claim to be the better or wiser because of my experiences. No. I think that a man who has lived as you have a sober and godly life is happier in every way. Yet you have lived otherwise gives a man a kind of strength, which is perhaps all he gains, together with many shadows. Now, let me tell you my thoughts about all this in an image. Suppose a blind man who sees nothing, stumbling along a road, tapping with his stick, walks into a stream of smoke from a pile of burning weeds. Now, he can perceive nothing with the eye, but he is aware that he is in a current of some kind, laden with the sense of a hidden fire. And he does not doubt of it, although he has but one sense that tells him. Well, you see, I think that the earth is full of similar currents, and that you and I that day stumbled upon one of them. There's some secret influence on that upland, setting from that stone that we know of along the old roadway. I mean, the dogs, without doubt, come across it and are full of rage because they know it to be something evil, something fatal to life. Evil befalls them. We've seen that with our own eyes, although I know of no agency that can inflict an outward wound by a stroke that can neither be heard nor seen. Dr. Friend sat silent for a moment, and then he said, I've been in a house once, very far away, in which I felt as I set foot that there was evil at work. There were spirits there, busy together, that whispered on the stairs and in dark corners, that had an enmity to men. Now that is the worst case, for in our adventure there was no particular enmity to us. But when by accident of curiosity we disturbed the source of the stream, as we might disturb a nest of wasps or a hill of ants, we were instantly assaulted. I do not pretend to understand these things, because, to be plain, I am not a man of any great knowledge in religion, which is, nevertheless, I do believe, a saving force. No, that is all that I can say, friend. That we stumbled, you and I, in all ignorance, across a certain line of powers, and I felt the pinch of it. I would like to hunt out the brood if I could, as I would hunt out a haunt of tigers, but I have not the means. And I doubt, with all my love for you, Du Cantoy, which is very great, if you have quite the stomach for it yourself. Indeed, I have not, said Mr. Du Cantoy hurriedly. I'll tell you one thing more, said Dr. Friend. I learned from that old fellow Strutt that once a year on a particular night, a cock is killed at Sparsholt by one of the villagers, and is set upon that stone to bleed into the hollows of it. I mean, why it is done, I know not. But Strutt said several times it is the custom. That seems to me a devilish business. But I would add, no, please add no more, said Du Cantoy with a sudden pallor. Let us just be thankful to have escaped with so little hurt. I am not the man for all this, dear sir. Let us forget about it and take our walks in gentler regions. It is too dark for me, and I would not willingly speak of it again. Yes, sir, said friend. You are right. There are secrets enough in the world, and we are not bound to affront them. It is enough to live soberly and penitently for what harm we have ourselves done, although I think you're a man of clearer conscience than I, and to commit these devilries, for that is what they are, to larger hands than ours.